Sarah and James were the perfect couple. At least, that's what everyone thought. They had the dream wedding, the honeymoon of a lifetime, and all the ingredients of a fairy tale love story. But within a year, their marriage was crumbling. Arguments over the smallest things, silent treatments that lasted days, and a growing emotional distance. They tried everything, therapy, date nights, even marriage retreats, but nothing seemed to work. Just when they were ready to give up, they stumbled upon one crucial truth that changed everything. What was it? Stay with me as we uncover the hidden key to a lasting marriage. Sarah met James on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the golden leaves danced around their feet, and the world seemed just a little more magical. She was lost in a book at a quiet cafe when he accidentally bumped into her table, sending her coffee spilling onto her favorite sweater. He was mortified, she was startled, and within minutes they were laughing over his clumsy attempt to clean it up. That moment sparked something unexpected. They spent hours talking, sharing stories about their lives, their dreams, and their love for adventure. James, an aspiring architect, had a passion for designing spaces that made people feel at home. Sarah, a freelance writer, found beauty in words, capturing emotions in stories that others could feel. Their worlds, though different, seemed to fit together perfectly, like two puzzle pieces finally finding their match. Their love story unfolded like the pages of a well-written novel. Late-night conversations that stretched into sunrise, spontaneous road trips that led to nowhere but felt like everywhere, and promises whispered under starlit skies. James adored Sarah's ability to find meaning in the smallest things, and Sarah loved the way James made her feel protected, as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. When James proposed a year later, it wasn't a grand spectacle. No fireworks, no elaborate plans, just a quiet moment by the lake where they had spent their first date. "I don't want perfect," he had said, holding her hands in his. "I just want you, every version of you, forever." And with tears in her eyes, Sarah had said yes. Their wedding was everything they had dreamed of. Simple, elegant, and filled with love. They danced under fairy lights, promising each other a lifetime of happiness. As they drove away that night, hand in hand, they both believed in the fairy tale, in the idea that love was enough. The early days of their marriage were blissful. They moved into a cozy apartment with sunlit windows and a balcony overlooking the city. Mornings were filled with shared cups of coffee, and nights with whispered dreams of their future. But then, something changed. Not all at once, not in a dramatic, earth-shattering way, but in small, quiet moments that neither of them noticed at first. It started with the little things. James would come home exhausted from work and collapse on the couch, barely acknowledging Sarah's excitement over her latest article. Sarah, feeling brushed aside, would retreat into her world of books, giving him the cold shoulder. The warmth they once had slowly turned into a lingering tension, a distance that neither of them knew how to close. Then came the misunderstandings. James forgot to pick up the groceries one evening, and Sarah took it as a sign that he didn't care. Sarah got caught up in work and forgot their dinner plans, and James saw it as a sign that she no longer prioritized him. The arguments that followed were never about the groceries or the missed dinner. They were about something deeper, something they couldn't quite name. Sarah started feeling unheard. She longed for the days when James would listen to her stories with fascination, ask her about her day, hold her just because. Now he seemed preoccupied, distracted, as if she had become just another part of his routine, rather than his partner. James, on the other hand, felt unappreciated. He worked hard, trying to build a stable future for them, but all he ever heard were complaints. How he wasn't present enough, how he didn't make time for her. He wondered if she even noticed how much pressure he was under, how much he was trying to be everything she needed. The love was still there, buried beneath the resentment, but neither of them knew how to reach it anymore. They started avoiding conversations, afraid that every discussion would turn into an argument. Nights that were once filled with laughter became filled with silence. One evening, after yet another argument over something trivial, Sarah finally broke. "Why does it feel like we're fighting all the time?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why does it feel like we're losing each other?" James didn't have an answer. He wanted to tell her that he still loved her, that he still saw her as the girl in the cafe with coffee on her sweater. But love didn't seem to be enough anymore. They tried to fix things. They planned date nights, hoping to rekindle the spark. They read relationship books, trying to understand what had gone wrong, but every attempt felt forced, like they were grasping at something that kept slipping through their fingers. One night, Sarah sat alone on their balcony, staring at the city lights. She thought about how they had started, how effortlessly they had fallen in love, but now love felt like hard work, like something they had to fight for, and she couldn't understand why. James sat inside, staring at an old photo of them, laughing at the beach, completely lost in each other. He wanted that back. But how? That's when the question hit them both, though they didn't say it out loud just yet. Why do so many marriages struggle, even when love is still there? What are we missing? Sarah and James sat in their living room, the air between them thick with silence. It had been weeks since their last real conversation, and every attempt to bridge the growing distance between them felt futile. The love was still there, somewhere, but buried beneath resentment, exhaustion, and unspoken pain. One evening, Sarah, scrolling through her phone in frustration, stumbled upon an ad for a weekend marriage retreat. Reignite your connection, the key to a lasting love. The words struck something deep inside her. She hesitated before showing it to James. "A marriage retreat?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "We need something, James. We keep trying and nothing is working. Maybe hearing other perspectives could help." James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers, talking about their marriage problems, made him uneasy. But the alternative, letting their relationship slowly unravel, was far worse. "Okay," he finally said, "let's try it." The retreat was held at a quiet lodge on the outskirts of town. The setting was serene, but as soon as the sessions began, Sarah and James realized that this was not the fairy tale solution they had imagined. The first couple to speak, Mark and Linda, had been married for 18 years. Linda's voice trembled as she shared how she had once believed their love was unbreakable, until she discovered Mark's affair. Mark, sitting beside her, looked down, ashamed. "I never stopped loving her," he said, "but I let the distance between us grow. I didn't feel appreciated, and when someone else made me feel seen, I made the worst mistake of my life." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't cheating on Sarah, but Mark's words struck a nerve. He, too, had been feeling invisible, unappreciated. Could he ever let things get that bad? The next couple, Jordan and Maria, had been married for 5 years. Their story was different but equally unsettling. "We used to be best friends," Maria said, "but over time it felt like we were living separate lives. We stopped talking, stopped laughing. We weren't fighting. We were just strangers." Sarah swallowed hard. That sounded painfully familiar. As story after story unfolded, it became clear that these were not just a rare, unfortunate cases. These were ordinary couples who had once been deeply in love just like them, but had slowly lost their way. For the first time, Sarah and James realized they weren't alone in their struggles. Midway through the retreat, the counselor leading the session stood up and shared a statistic that sent a chill through the room. "Did you know," he began, "that nearly 50% of marriages end in divorce? And do you know what's even more alarming? Most of these couples never realize the real reason why." A murmur rippled through the audience. James felt Sarah's hand tighten around his. The counselor continued, "We like to think that marriages fail because of big, dramatic reasons. Infidelity, financial problems, major betrayals. But the truth is, most marriages don't fall apart in a single moment. They erode slowly over time due to a lack of something most people don't even know they need." Sarah and James exchanged a glance. What was he talking about? They had read books, tried to communicate, gone on date nights. What were they missing? The counselor didn't reveal the answer just yet. Instead, he left them with a question that haunted them the rest of the weekend. What if love isn't enough? After the retreat, Sarah and James were quiet on the drive home. The stories they had heard clung to them, and the question loomed in their minds. That night, as James sat in the dimly lit living room, he found himself reaching for his phone. Without thinking, he dialed his grandfather's number. James's grandfather, Henry, had been married to his wife, Margaret, for over 50 years. They were the couple everyone admired, the ones who still held hands, still laughed at old jokes, still seemed completely in sync. James. Henry's voice was warm, full of life despite his age. "How's my grandson?" James hesitated before answering. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." James took a deep breath. "How did you and Grandma make it work for so long? How do you still love each other after all these years?" Henry chuckled softly. "Ah, the age-old question. Let me tell you something, son. Love isn't enough." James sat up. There it was again, that same unsettling idea from the retreat. "What do you mean?" "Love is important, James. But if love were enough, marriages wouldn't fall apart as often as they do." Henry's voice grew serious. "Without this one thing, love will always fade." James felt his heart beat faster. "What's the one thing?" "Emotional safety." James frowned. "Emotional safety?" "Yes," Henry said. "See, people think marriage is about passion, romance, and grand gestures, but what keeps two people together for a lifetime is the ability to feel completely safe with each other. Safe to be vulnerable, safe to express emotions without fear of being ignored or judged, safe to be fully seen and still loved. The moment emotional safety disappears, love starts to wither." James was silent. He had never thought of it that way. Henry continued, "Your grandmother and I, we had our share of storms, but no matter how bad things got, we always made sure that home, our marriage, was a place where we could be ourselves without fear. We listened, we reassured, we created a space where both of us felt valued. That's what keeps love alive." James swallowed hard. He thought back to his marriage. How many times had he dismissed Sarah's feelings? How many times had she pulled away, feeling unheard? Had their love started fading, not because they didn't care, but because they no longer felt safe opening up? "Son," Henry said gently, "if you don't fix the emotional safety in your marriage, it doesn't matter how much you love Sarah. Eventually, that love will feel like a burden instead of a gift." James felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, he felt like he had an answer, something real, something tangible. He needed to talk to Sarah. When James shared his grandfather's words with Sarah later that night, she was skeptical. "Emotional safety," she repeated. "What does that even mean for us?" "It means," James hesitated, searching for the right words, "it means we need to create a space where we feel safe to be honest with each other, without fear of judgment or defensiveness, where we actually listen instead of just waiting to respond, where we don't feel like we're walking on eggshells around each other." Sarah crossed her arms. "And you think that's what's been missing?" "I think it might be," James admitted. "Think about it, Sarah. When was the last time you felt truly heard by me? When was the last time I felt understood by you?" Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but then she stopped, because deep down, she knew the answer. Still, part of her resisted. "So you're saying all our problems come down to emotional safety?" "I don't know," James said honestly, "but I think it's worth finding out." Sarah sighed. "And what if we try this and it still doesn't work?" James reached for her hand, the first time he had done so in a long while. "Then at least we'll know we gave it everything." For the first time in months, Sarah felt something different. Not a solution, not a guarantee, but a flicker of hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin. The walls of their apartment trembled with the echoes of their latest argument. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her face flushed with frustration, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. James stood across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with the exhaustion of months, no, years, of unresolved tension. "Do you even hear yourself, James?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Every time I try to tell you how I feel, you shut me down like I'm some irrational child." James exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. And every time I try to explain myself, you twist my words like I'm the villain. I'm tired, Sarah. I'm so damn tired of feeling like I'm never enough for you. The air between them was suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded as a wave of helplessness washed over her. It had been like this for so long, miscommunication turning into resentment, love buried beneath layers of frustration. She couldn't take it anymore. I'm done talking, she whispered, grabbing her keys off the counter. Sarah. But she was already out the door, slamming it behind her. James stood there, staring at the space she had just occupied, the fight still burning in his chest. He wanted to run after her, to tell her he didn't mean half of what he said, but something held him back. Instead, he collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, he allowed himself to sit in the silence, truly feeling the weight of their failing marriage. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Love isn't enough, son. Without emotional safety, love will always fade. He had dismissed it at first, thinking it was just old-fashioned wisdom, but now, sitting alone in an empty apartment, he realized this was it. This was the moment where they either saved their marriage or lost it forever. James sat up, running his hands through his hair. His eyes landed on an old wooden box on the bookshelf, the one that hadn't been touched in years. Something in him stirred. Slowly he stood up, walked over, and pulled it down. Dust had settled over the lid, but as he opened it, memories came rushing back. Inside, folded neatly, were the handwritten letters he used to write to Sarah before they got married. His hands trembled as he picked one up. The paper was slightly yellowed, but his words remained clear, written in the eager, love-drunk handwriting of a younger man. My love, it began, every day with you feels like a dream I never want to wake up from. I promise to always listen to you, to always make you feel heard, seen, and cherished. You are my safe place, and I want to be yours forever. James inhaled sharply. You are my safe place. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped being that for her, and she had stopped being that for him. His grandfather had been right. Love wasn't enough. Passion, effort, grand gestures, none of it mattered if they didn't feel safe with each other. He had spent so much time defending himself in arguments, proving his point, trying to be right, when all Sarah had ever needed was to feel heard. That was the missing piece, and if he didn't fix it now, he would lose her. James bolted up from the couch, heart pounding. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door. The night air was cold against his skin as he scanned the street. He knew Sarah too well. She wouldn't have gone far. Then he saw it, their car parked at the end of the street. Sarah was sitting inside, her head resting against the steering wheel. James' chest tightened. She was crying. Taking a deep breath, he walked over and knocked gently on the window. She didn't look up at first. Then slowly, she wiped her face and rolled it down. Her eyes were red, her expression guarded. What do you want, James? He crouched beside the car, his voice softer than it had been in years, to finally listen. Sarah let out a hollow laugh. You always say that, and then we just end up right back where we started. James shook his head. Not this time. She looked at him, searching his face for the fight that was always there. But this time, she didn't see anger. She saw something else. Vulnerability. Can we talk? He asked, not to argue, not to prove who's right, just talk. Sarah hesitated, but then, after a long moment, she unlocked the door. James slid into the passenger seat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had been through sat heavy between them. Then James broke the silence. I read my old letters to you tonight. Sarah glanced at him, surprised. I found one where I wrote that I wanted to be your safe place, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, and I realized I stopped being that for you a long time ago. Sarah swallowed, her hands gripping the steering wheel. I don't think I've been that for you either. He exhaled. No, you haven't. But it's not because we don't love each other. It's because somewhere along the way we stopped making each other feel safe. Sarah blinked, her breath hitching. Safe? James turned to her. his eyes full of the truth he had been too blind to see before. "That's what we've lost, Sarah. We fight because we feel unheard. We shut down because we feel unappreciated. We drift apart because we don't feel safe enough to be vulnerable anymore." Sarah's lips parted, but she didn't speak. James continued, "We keep trying to fix this by going on dates, making efforts, saying we love each other, but none of that matters if we don't feel emotionally safe, if we don't trust that we can be honest without being judged, if we don't feel like we matter to each other beyond just being married." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "James, I see it now," he whispered. "Every time you told me you felt unheard, I got defensive instead of listening. Every time I felt unappreciated, I shut down instead of telling you. We built walls when we should have been building safety." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "I miss us," she admitted. "I miss feeling like we're a team." James reached for her hand, his touch gentle, hesitant. "Then let's fix it. But not by forcing love, by rebuilding our safety, by making sure we can trust each other with the hard conversations, by listening even when it's uncomfortable." Sarah looked down at their intertwined fingers, then up into his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she saw the man she had fallen in love with. Not just her husband, not just her partner in fights, but her person. A tear slipped down her cheek. "Okay," she whispered. James gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, and in that moment, they both knew this wasn't the end of their love story. It was the beginning of something stronger. The morning after their conversation in the car, Sarah and James sat across from each other at the kitchen table, cups of coffee between them. There was no tension in the air, just quiet understanding, the weight of unspoken truths still settling. James finally broke the silence. "So, where do we start?" Sarah stirred her coffee, thinking, "We've spent so much time trying to prove who's right. Maybe we should start by proving to each other that we care more about our connection than being right." James nodded. "Emotional safety first." And with that, they made a promise, not just to love each other, but to protect the space where their love could thrive. They started small. Each morning, they committed to 5 minutes of undistracted conversation. No phones, no interruptions. They didn't talk about work, bills, or responsibilities. Instead, they asked each other, "How are you feeling today?" and truly listened. At first, it felt unnatural, like they were forcing something that should come naturally, but the more they practiced, the more they realized how much they had been missing. One evening, Sarah hesitated before speaking. "I feel overwhelmed lately," she admitted, "like I'm carrying so much on my own." James fought the urge to respond defensively. Instead, he asked, "What do you need from me?" Sarah blinked. She wasn't used to him asking that. "I don't know. Just to feel like I'm not doing it all alone." James reached for her hand. "Then let's make a plan together. We're a team, remember?" For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone in their marriage. Days turned into weeks. Slowly but surely, their relationship transformed. Arguments that once lasted hours now ended in minutes. Instead of snapping, they paused. Instead of attacking, they asked, "Help me understand why you feel that way." One night, Sarah felt herself getting frustrated over something small, James forgetting to take out the trash. Normally, she would have snapped. Instead, she took a breath. "It really bothers me when things get left undone. It makes me feel like I'm the only one keeping up with the house." James didn't react defensively. Instead, he nodded. "I get that. I'll try to be more mindful." A simple response, but to Sarah, it meant everything. They replaced blame with curiosity. Instead of assuming the worst about each other, they started asking questions. "Why did that upset you? What do you need from me right now? How can I make you feel safer in our relationship?" And every time they asked, they listened, not to respond, but to understand. As they worked on their relationship, Sarah and James sought wisdom from other couples who had been in their shoes. They met a couple at their church, Michael and Lisa, who had been married for 30 years. "We almost didn't make it," Lisa admitted. After our first child was born, we drifted apart. We were arguing constantly, and I felt like Michael didn't care about my feelings. Michael nodded. I thought I was doing my part, working, providing, but I wasn't there for her emotionally. She didn't feel safe enough to be honest with me. It wasn't until I started listening, really listening, that things changed. Lisa smiled. The moment I felt like I could share my heart without fear of judgment, everything shifted. That's when we truly became partners again. Their words resonated deeply with Sarah and James. It wasn't just them. Other couples had struggled too, and those who survived and thrived all had one thing in common: emotional safety. To gain a deeper understanding, Sarah and James decided to visit a marriage therapist. Dr. Elaine Carter had counseled hundreds of couples. When they shared their journey, she smiled knowingly. You've discovered something that many couples never do, she said. Most people think love is enough, but love without emotional safety is like a house without a foundation. It will eventually crumble. Sarah leaned forward. So how do we make sure we keep building that safety? Dr. Carter nodded. First, understand that emotional safety isn't about agreeing all the time. It's about creating a space where both of you can express your thoughts and feelings without fear. Second, prioritize repair over winning. When conflict arises, focus on fixing the disconnection rather than proving a point. Third, validate each other. Even if you don't understand why your partner feels a certain way, let them know that their feelings matter. And lastly, keep choosing each other every single day. Emotional safety isn't a one-time achievement. It's something you nurture continuously. Sarah and James left that session with a newfound commitment, not just to staying married, but to creating a marriage that felt safe, nurturing, and fulfilling. One evening, as James helped his grandfather tend to the garden, he finally asked, "Grandpa, how did you and Grandma make it through all these years?" His grandfather chuckled, setting down his watering can. "Would you believe me if I told you I almost lost her?" James's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" His grandfather sighed. 40 years ago, your grandma packed her bags, said she couldn't do it anymore. I was stubborn back then, thought love was enough to fix anything." "What changed?" His grandfather's eyes softened. "I finally listened." He wiped his hands and leaned in. "She told me she didn't feel seen. She didn't feel valued. She loved me, but she didn't feel safe enough to be honest with me. And I realized I had been loving her, but I hadn't been making her feel safe in that love." James swallowed. "So I did the hardest thing a man can do. I put my pride aside. I listened. I validated. I reassured her that her feelings mattered. And once she felt safe again, our love became stronger than ever." James exhaled, feeling the weight of his grandfather's words. "That's why I told you, son. Love isn't enough. Without emotional safety, love fades, but with it, love only grows." That night, as James lay in bed beside Sarah, he turned to her and whispered, "I never want you to feel unsafe in this love again." Sarah smiled softly, running her fingers through his hair. "I don't, not anymore." And for the first time in years, they both fell asleep feeling completely at peace, because they knew they had finally found the missing piece of their love. Sarah sat on their front porch, watching the evening sky melt into soft shades of pink and orange. The cool breeze carried the scent of fresh rain, and she inhaled deeply, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in years. James stepped outside, 2 cups of tea in his hands, and handed her one. Their fingers brushed briefly, a small but meaningful connection. "Thinking about everything we've been through?" he asked, settling beside her. She nodded. "Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, how close we came to losing everything?" James exhaled, shaking his head. "I used to think love was enough, that if we just loved each other, everything else would fall into place." He turned to her, his gaze soft. "But love without emotional safety is like planting a tree in rocky soil. It might survive for a while, but eventually it won't have the roots to hold on." Sarah sipped her tea. "I wish we had learned this sooner." James smirked. "Yeah, but maybe we had to go through all of it to really understand." She thought about that for a moment. There had been nights when she wondered if their love would survive, moments when the hurt felt bigger than the love. But now, sitting here with James, not just as his wife, but as his partner, she realized that every struggle had led them to this understanding. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was strong, because now they both understood that emotional safety wasn't just a nice thing to have. It was the thing that made everything else possible. As they sat there, Sarah and James reflected on what had truly changed in their marriage. Sarah used to feel like she was walking on eggshells, afraid to say how she really felt because she didn't want to start another argument. James, on the other hand, often felt attacked whenever she brought up a concern. Now, they had a simple rule: listen to understand, not to defend. Whenever one of them had something to say, even if it was hard to hear, the other made the conscious effort to listen with an open heart. One night, after a long day at work, Sarah had sighed and said, "I feel like I never have time for myself anymore." The old James would have responded with something defensive like, "Well, I work hard too, you know," but instead he simply asked, "What do you need?" That small shift, replacing defensiveness with curiosity, changed everything. They had also learned that the way they spoke to each other mattered just as much as what they were saying. During an argument, it was easy to let frustration take over, but now they both reminded themselves, would I speak to a friend this way? Words had power, and they had learned to use theirs to heal rather than hurt. One evening, after a minor disagreement about dinner plans, James had sighed and said, "You never listen to what I want." Sarah had taken a deep breath and rephrased her response. "I hear you. I just also want us to consider what works best for both of us. How do we compromise?" That simple shift from accusation to collaboration turned what could have been a fight into a conversation. One of the biggest turning points in their marriage was realizing that winning an argument didn't actually mean winning. Early in their marriage, both of them had fought to be right. They had kept mental scorecards, tallying up past mistakes to use as ammunition in future fights. Now they had one guiding question whenever they disagreed. What matters more, being right or being close? One day, James had been frustrated that Sarah forgot to pick up something from the store. He was about to say something sharp, but then he stopped himself. Would pointing out her mistake bring them closer? Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "I know you've had a busy day. I'll grab it tomorrow." Sarah looked up surprised. "You're not upset?" James smiled. "It's not worth being upset over. We're on the same team." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Same team. Those two words had become their new mantra. The most important thing they had learned was that love wasn't just about grand gestures or romantic moments. It was about creating a space where both of them could be their truest selves, without fear. Sarah had always struggled with expressing her deeper fears. She worried about being too emotional, too needy. But James had learned to hold space for her feelings rather than trying to fix them. One evening she had admitted, "Sometimes I worry that I'm not enough for you." The old James might have brushed it off, saying something like, "That's silly, of course you are." But instead he pulled her into his arms and said, "You don't have to be anything other than who you are. I love you completely." That was all she had ever needed to hear, and James, too, had started opening up in ways he never had before. He admitted when he was scared, when he felt uncertain, and Sarah never judged him for it. She simply held space for him, just as he did for her. As they sat together in the fading light, Sarah turned to James. "Do you think other couples know this?" James shook his head. "I think most people don't even realize what's missing." Sarah sighed. "I wish someone had told us earlier." James thought for a moment. Maybe that's our purpose now, to help others see what we didn't. So they made a decision, one that would extend beyond their own marriage. They would share their journey with others. They would encourage couples to ask themselves the hard questions. Do you feel emotionally safe in your relationship? Can you be honest without fear of judgment? Do you prioritize connection over being right? Does your partner feel truly heard and valued? Because love wasn't just about passion, romance, or even commitment. It was about creating a love that felt safe, a love where both partners could be vulnerable without fear. Sarah and James knew they would still have challenges, they would still have disagreements, but now they had something they never had before, a foundation strong enough to weather any storm, and that made all the difference. As they sat in the peaceful silence of their home, James squeezed Sarah's hand and whispered, "We finally got it right, didn't we?" Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We finally got it safe." Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like you couldn't truly be yourself, where you were afraid to speak up, scared of being misunderstood, or worried that your feelings didn't matter? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt emotionally unsafe in a relationship? What did you do to overcome it? If you found this video helpful, check out our other videos on strengthening relationships and deepening emotional connections. There's so much more to love than just feelings. It's about building a foundation that lasts. And remember, love alone isn't enough. But when you add emotional safety, love becomes unbreakable.